Pack Rat Middens has been the main tool for reconstructing past environments. He's the lead editor of an important book that many of us use on pack rat midden analysis and reconstructing the last 40,000 years of desert environments. And yeah, he's an amazing person. He has his finger in a lot of areas of science. So I turn it over to Julio. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, everybody, for coming. And this is not going to be about biogeography. It's primarily going to be about phenology and the timing of seasonal transitions. And actually, Montana State is one of the places where efforts that I've worked on at the national level started with a fellow by the name of Joe Caprio that some of you probably knew. He died a few years ago. And he and his wife, Mickey, used to come to Tucson all the time, so I spent a tremendous amount of time with him. He was hired at Montana State in 1956 as the state climatologist. And as part of his job, he decided to actually create something called the Western States Phenological Network. And phenology is the study of the events in the annual life cycle of plants and animals. And Joe focused on a plant that a lot of the settlers had brought in and had in their yards, which are lilacs and also honeysuckles. And he did something amazing. He just, within a matter of just a few years, he ended up having about 2,500 people engaged in reporting observations on phenophases of lilac. You know, the budding out, bud burst, leaf out, first flowering, and a lot of the plants that people were measuring were actually clonal plants. So over the whole West, they were actually measuring the same plant without much variation. And it was extremely successful, but like most networks, when the hero either retires or dies, the network goes under. And he retired in 1994. And then a couple of colleagues of mine within USGS, Dan Cahan and Mike Dettinger, restarted the network a few years later because they realized the importance of seasonal timing, particularly things like spring onset, which seem to be driving a lot of the changes that we're seeing in Western North America. Another close friend of mine, Mark Schwartz, was actually managing the lilac and honeysuckle network in the Midwest and the Eastern U.S. and had started to put the whole thing together at the national level. And planets aligned in a really weird way. I was running a meeting on the ecological impacts of climate change and what the National Ecological Observatory, NEON, would do to study it, engage it. And it was going to end up being about, I could tell right off the bat, it was going to end up being about ecologists doing what they normally do, which is measure the crap out of everything in one place. And my ambition for it was actually a spatially distributed wall-to-wall network of standardized observations that would be maintained. The observations would be made by everybody, including citizen scientists and scientists alike. And so I kind of had this idea. I went to Steve Running, who's an old friend of mine at Montana State, University of Montana in Missoula. And I told him my idea because I wasn't getting much traction with NEON. And he said, why don't you call this guy Mark Schwartz? He's been talking about doing this stuff for a long time. And no knock on Mark, he's great. But he said, Mark doesn't have the personality to do this. So, and ultimately you have the government, you have the federal contacts to be able to push this. So we approached, we actually got the whole community together that was interested in phenology in Tucson. And we ran a couple of meetings, and then I went to USGS and asked them for base stable funding to run the network, and citing the office at the University of Arizona. And so we actually did that. We opened for business in 2007. So part of this talk is actually driven very much by the creation of community of practice that looks at phenology and seasonal timing across North America, and particularly in the United States, in lots of different ways. So there's a picture of Joe when he was hired, and he was doing primarily to inform decisions in agriculture in the state of Montana. Really cool guy, just a sweetheart. I loved spending time with him. The guy on the right of me is actually Mark Schwartz, who's at University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and kind of took up where Joe had left off. So we created a new network, a national network, with USGS at the helm, but everybody involved. And part of what we were doing was actually creating a community of practice that was laser focused on seasonal timing in the climate system, and also seasonal timing in physical systems and biological systems across the U.S. Emily is not moving.
He's looking there.
I am. Okay.
You're going to have to click down on these little guys right in the corner.
Okay. So the National Phenology Network is a large-scale network of repeated integrated plant and animal observations and phenological observations and the tools to analyze them at local and national scale. So we're pretty much over 10,000 observers, and they're observing lots of different phenophases for both plants and animals. So we have, at this point, several million observations that have accumulated just since 2007. And the basis here is not just necessarily to have data on plant phenology for lots of different species, but using those data to create continental scale phenological models that, with weather data and weather-based algorithms, can actually, drive surfaces in seasonal timing and phenology across the continent. So that's on the right-hand side of, the dashboard of all the things that we measure and the number of observers. And you can go online and write National Phenology Network on Google, and then start clicking around, get on a program called Nature's Notebook that is a citizen science program, and you could be making observations tomorrow relatively easily. And in fact, I invite you to do so. Okay, either I'm doing this wrong or...
The stuff in the corner down there, you have to click on it with your mouse.
Oh, I see what you were saying. Okay. There we go. All right. So, most of you realize that phenology is actually pretty critical to the functioning of the Earth and the biosphere. And it's critical at different time scales, from minutes to hours to years to century, and it affects lots of different things. It affects a lot of things. Phenology modulates a lot of things, including, food production, geochemical cycles, recreation, all sorts of things. And we're probably pretty aware of that in Montana. So one of the things that we've done over the years, we obtained an NSF Research Coordination Network grant that was about $500,000, and it kept us assembling the community interested in this over a period of 5-6 years. And it was tremendous. Right from the very beginning, there was a buzz in the air, and people said, this is an idea whose time has come. Now, I want to make a brief comment. It's not necessarily being critical of the ecological community, but it is, in fact, an oversight on our part. And that is that, particularly as community ecologists, we really focused at the plot scale. And we haven't really understood that if you're going to predict ecological responses to climate, what you're going to really focus on is the synchrony term. How in synchrony populations of different species respond to climate variability and climate change. So it's not a matter of taking a near-term climatic prediction and trying to run a stand model. You'll fail miserably doing that. There's too much that's locally idiosyncratic in local ecosystems. And so the reality is that the thing you're going to be able to predict is the highest signal to noise ratio, which is in the synchrony term. So that was actually my reason, my justification for creating the National Phenological Network. We've done a lot of other stuff, but this is what we're trying to impress upon ecologists, that we actually need to invest in these wall-to-wall ecological networks with standardized and routine measurements. NEON didn't do that, and there really is nobody else other than, you know, outfits like the Cornell Lab of Ornithology for birds, National Phenology Network, and maybe a few other things. This is not something that we've invested very much. Therefore, we don't really know really critical questions like how do variations in the timing of phenophases drive population abundance at different temporal and spatial scales. That's a mouthful, but I've been in a room full of National Academy members where you realized when you said that, the mouths were agape. People realized we don't know how seasonal timing affects population abundance, simply because we haven't been making these measurements at the right scale. So one of the things that we did is we assembled a forecasting phenology group that was part of the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis prior to them being defunded by NSF, but they're still going strong. And they were run by two young scientists, Lizzie Wolkovich, who's now at Harvard, and Ben Cook, who's a climatologist, who is at NASA. And they were incredible leaders of this synthesis group. And so we started writing lots of papers addressing sort of the ecology, the large-scale ecology of phenology. And this was actually one of the first papers predicting phenology by integrating ecology, evolution, and climate science, starting to actually go at this from a very interdisciplinary perspective. So one of the things that this group did was create a large database and use existing databases, particularly in Europe. There were, in fact, wall-to-wall for very few species, but wall-to-wall, lots of observations of the appropriate densities, primarily, though, agricultural species, some native species. And so there's a database called the Pan-European Phenological Database that we all refer to it as PEP 7025 for first flowering and first leaf dates. And so we actually got a hold of that database, and then we created one of our own, primarily in North America, but also expanding to Europe, which had about 1,200 species, but it was more point-based rather than spatially distributed. And we started doing meta-analysis on both of those data sets. The one that we created is the network, Ecological and Climatological Timings Across Regions, or NECTAR, and you can go online and actually download data. And so as part of this NC's forecasting phenology group, we created large databases, and we're still working on that. So I want to give you a couple of examples, and then I'm going to turn to the real subject of the talk, which is about the climatologies of seasonal transition variations and trends. But before I do that, I want to make a couple of observations. So we took these databases, and we did two different meta-analysis. We took the NECTAR database, which is an observational database, and we tried to look at the temperature sensitivity of first leaf and first flower for as many species as we could, which in this case is about 1,200. And then we did a meta-analysis of first leaf and first flower in warming experiments across the Northern Hemisphere. This is an expensive venture, right? There are warming experiments going on, you know, all over North America, Europe, and Eurasia. And we've probably spent $150 to $200 million or more on these experiments. So what we wanted to do is compare the sensitivity, the temperature sensitivity of leafing and flowering in completely different data sets, one from experimental data and the other one from observational data, and see what the differences were. And it turned out that the warming experiments underpredicted the observations by factors of 4 for leaf out and 8 for flowering, factors of 4 and 8. And that raised, we published this paper in Nature, and I got to tell you, we got a rash of crap from all the people doing warming experiments across the Northern Hemisphere. I mean, this got sent to Science. It was reviewed 3 different times by 3 different reviewers and then turned down, and then we sent it to Nature. It got reviewed 3 different times by 3 different reviewers and got accepted. The lesson here is that sometimes this is really, really hard. And the paper, from my perspective, didn't change 1 iota, which is the moral of the story, I think, is that the peer review system sometimes is, it eats up a lot of time. I think Lizzie told me one day when we were going back and forth writing this paper that she'd written 1,000 lines of code and respond to reviewers, and nothing changed. So this raises a very interesting question, and that is, what is it that we know about phenology from all these different kinds of information? So I just talked about comparing warming experiments and observational data, and they don't agree. A bunch of buddies of mine wrote a paper in 2009 comparing start of spring metrics in different remote sensing platforms, and they found very little agreement as well. So think of the money we spent, probably $1.5 billion a year on remote sensing platforms, and something as significant as green up. We actually don't have much agreement depending on algorithm and remote sensing platform. And then another group of colleagues of mine, led by Andrew Richardson, they were looking at comparisons between phenology and ecosystem models that are tied into Earth system models or general circulation models that have the biosphere as a component. And then they started comparing against flux data from flux towers. And it turns out that there's not very much agreement. Now, the assumption here is that the flux data is somehow right. I want to go back to the synchrony term that I was just talking about and tell you that I am suspicious of flux tower data, simply because the assumption is I'm going to measure local fluxes in energy, water, and chemical elements, and I'm going to do that at the stand level, and I'm assuming this can be scaled. But if I had 10 sites within the same biome and within the same hydroclimatic area, the same area that experiences interannual variability and climate interannual variability in climate, that the likelihood is that there's not that much agreement across those 10 flux towers. And so flux tower measurements could actually be also idiosyncratic, locally idiosyncratic. So we don't know which one's right and which one's wrong. So think about this. This is an important thing. This is, you're talking about green up. You're trying to plug this into predictive models. And all of these things disagree quite a bit. And so I think if I had a congressman coming up to me or a smart staffer and asking the question of, whether or not we can actually predict these seasonal transitions that seem to be driving a lot of the impacts that we're seeing, not just in North America, but also globally. And I would have a really hard time saying which one of these approaches is actually right, because the results are so different. So I want to turn my attention to the subject of the talk, which is something that I've been working on quite a bit. I actually think for most of these assessments, including the national assessment, we need a framework of continental scale climate variability and trends. In order to be able to interpret, in order to be able to hook all this stuff that we're doing in global ecology that is driven by climate rather than land use. And what I just said is something that is really hard for people to somehow grasp. It was hard for the people in the National Climate Assessment to actually grasp, is that we don't have that framework, and if we did, we could do lots of things that are kind of unimaginable. We just published a paper in PNAS that basically determines that eruption of boreal seed-eating birds that breed in the boreal forest and then migrate over the continent irregularly, they're facultative migrants, are actually tracking climatic dipoles. So they're being pushed and pulled across the continent by juxtaposed areas of any-phase climate variability. We wouldn't know that were it not for the fact that we've got something called Project Feeder Watch, which has collected 2 million observations on just one species of boreal bird. And so these continental scale frameworks are going to be able to explain things that were as much of a mystery as Santa Claus. Birders all over North America, for them, this was an unknown. What climatically drove boreal bird eruptions? This is a big, huge phenomenon in ornithology. So most of us assume that the changes that we're seeing in seasonal transitions is necessarily anthropogenic. And we don't really know that. This was a study that was done by Lex Stein, Peter Heuber at Harvard, first published in Nature in 2009, and then another paper published in Journal of Climate in 2012, where they actually took all of the daily temperature data for the Northern Hemisphere, and they looked at the annual phasing of it in the ocean and on land. And it turns out that on land, what's happened since about 1950 is that the curve of the annual phasing of, the annual march of temperatures when averaged over the Northern Hemisphere has actually shifted to the left about a day and a half. It is not something that's simulated by general circulation models. So we really don't understand what's going on. So think about this. The whole annual march in temperatures has been shifted to the left earlier in the spring, and we don't really know what's driving it. We assume it's anthropogenic. It could be as complicated as ozone in the mid to upper troposphere and lower stratosphere. We really don't know. So understanding the climatology, we tend to think of seasonal transitions and things like phenology. We tend to think of it from the ground up, but it's primarily being driven, from atmospheric circulation down. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that we actually don't have an index of the climatological spring in the Northern Hemisphere. Right? If you talk to a climatologist and you ask them, what would you have, they would probably say, well, it's the shift in circulation from really strong westerlies during the winter to weak easterlies at high latitudes during the summer. And so however you want to define that transition, that would be the climatological spring onset for the Northern Hemisphere. We don't have anything like that. There's some things that you could probably use, but it still doesn't exist. Instead, we've got indices like green up, NDVI-driven green up from remote sensing platforms. So most of our indices are actually from the ground up rather than from the top down. As a consequence, we really haven't understood what climatologically is driving variations in trends in spring onset. And this is extremely important because we may actually be assuming things that are just generally not true. So it may end up being that a lot of the things that we're seeing are driven by decadal to multi-decadal variability in atmospheric circulation that may or may not be linked to greenhouse warming. And we don't know that. The models really don't, the general circulation models don't do a good job of circulation, particularly complicated circulation that are associated with things like the Arctic Oscillation, the Northern Annular Mode, the Pacific North American pattern, the North Atlantic Oscillation, El Nino Southern Oscillation, and I have a friend of mine that's a Russian climatologist that lives here in the States, and whenever I start talking about the PDO, the AMO, and he always says, yeah, and EIEIO, because we have all of these indices that we try to make sense of. But a lot of these variations are actually driven by climate variability that may in fact be natural, and we have a hard time sorting these things out. But it's key, we have to understand it, because that's where the forecast may actually come from, is understanding that. So the National Climate Assessment has, over the last couple of years, gathered up technical groups that are developing indicators of climate variability and change for the nation that can be used by anybody, by all stakeholders, by the general public. You've probably heard quite a bit about this of late. You can go to their website, the U.S. Global Change Research Program, and look at these indicators, and you can read the text yourself. But they're trying to create indicators that some of us, not the Global Change Research Office, so it's kind of an unfunded mandate, but some of us actually maintain in perpetuity for free. And so I was on the seasonal timing technical, the seasonal timing and phenology group, and we ended up making a recommendation for 8 different indicators to use. And these are probably indicators that are relevant to Montana and to a Montana assessment. And you can see most of these seasonal climate indicators that are things like last spring frost freeze, the first fall frost freeze, the length, the duration of the frost freeze season, exceedant dates for heating or precipitation, heat stress, so forth and so on. And some of these are satellite driven. For example, the potential growing season is actually being made from microwave satellite measurements. It only goes back into the early 90s, so it's not long enough. Extended spring indices, which I'm going to talk about quite a bit, which are algorithms based on what we know about lilacs and honeysuckle, which are really sensitive to the beginning of the growing season. Snowmelt runoff, the center of mass timing, freshwater ice seasonality. These are networks that have actually been going on for quite a long time, and the National Climate Assessment is actually now adopting them. The vegetation growing season, a remote sensing indicator of green up, the wildfire season, but not numbers of fires that are of a particular size, but rather the flammable season timing and duration, and start, peak, end, and duration, because I think that's a much better indicator. Fires occur according to lots of different conditions, including climate and ignitions, and it's fairly complicated. And flammable season is not as complicated. So the flammable season is probably the indicator that we'll end up doing. And then organismal phenology, species migration is the one, bird migration is the one that we've been focusing on. So only a few of these have actually made it into the initial system of, or the preliminary system of indicators, and some of the ones that we have are ones that were adopted. And I'm just going to be talking about some of the work that some of us are doing to try to support these indicators, try to get scientific background for these indicators so that when we post them up, they're supported by a lot of information. So we're working fast to try to get this done. So I'm going to focus only on a couple of them, and I'm going to focus on timing and duration of frost-free season. That's a paper that I published with my colleague Greg McCabe in USGS. He's based at Denver, and he and I have published a lot of papers together, including with Greg Peterson, who's here in the office. And then I'm going to talk about this spring index that I've mentioned a couple of times, which is a weather-based algorithm that's validated with lilac and honeysuckle data. And we've been working with this index that is station-based, meaning it's an index that you can calculate for any station that actually has a daily Tmax and Tmin. And now what we've done is we've actually taken the index and computed it for the NC's reanalysis data, which is a continuous surface. So now we have an index that people can play with in lots of different ways without having to rely on the station density. So this is a paper that just came out in Journal of Climate. I'm not going to talk about the boreal burr eruptions. So Greg and I and a colleague at University of Arkansas, Song Feng, published a paper this year in International Journal of Climatology that looks at variability and trends in the start and in the length of frost-free periods across the U.S. from 1920 to 2012. And we are very interested in this because it constrains freeze-thaw processes. It paces the annual life cycle of plants and animals. There are a lot of critters that are actually sensitive to the timing of the first spring freeze and the last fall freeze. It affects human production, food production, and it influences land-atmosphere interactions, including water and carbon cycles. And people have done this before. We're actually just trying to update it so when people use this indicator, they have some background already on the trends that have occurred, not just at the continental scale, but at the regional scale. And you know, a lot of people assume that greenhouse warming is occurring directly overhead, and it's not. The ocean is being heated up differentially, and then the atmospheric circulation is actually carrying that heat to other places, and it's highly variable. So there's something called, I want to ask this question because I think it's critical. How many of you have heard of a term called the warming hole? The warming hole is actually in reference to the southeastern U.S. and the plains, where it hasn't been warming at the same rate as everywhere else. And in fact, in some cases, it's actually been cooling, with the spring delayed rather than advanced. So the assumption is that, you know, we're having an advance in the growing season everywhere simultaneously. The reason you have a warming hole is because of internal Pacific decadal variability, internal variability in the Pacific Ocean. And that warming hole is actually linked to stuff that's happening across northern Eurasia, where also the spring onset and wintertime temperatures are not necessarily heating up in the same way that we're seeing elsewhere. And so this stuff is really important to know. As scientists, many of us don't know it. Imagine that the public is also totally unaware that this is the case. So this is the paper we published, and most of this is just, you know, empirical, historical, just trying to figure out what the patterns are. And so this is the mean and standard deviation of these metrics, the duration of the frost-free season, and then the date of last spring frost and first fall frost. And the mean is not important here, but I wanted you to kind of focus on the standard deviation for these things. And one of the things that you'll notice is there's this band from the southeastern U.S. all the way to the Pacific Northwest, where the variance of these metrics is actually much higher. And you can kind of think about this, it kind of makes sense if you think about it in terms of the polar vortex, right? Where you have this variability in the westerlies in the polar jet stream, and the canonical pattern, a very typical pattern, is the jet stream being far displaced in the west and being far displaced to the south in the east. And so there's this incredible difference between the east and the west, and this dipole figures prominently in some of the patterns that I'll show. Here is a map of the linear trends in the number of days, and just focus on the right-hand side that are the sites that have really significant trends. The other trends probably spatially are correct, but those are not necessarily significant for each of the stations. And so for the most part, there are things that you probably know. The duration of the growing season has been getting longer over much of the United States, but not necessarily everywhere. The last spring frost is advanced over the country, and for the most part, the reason that the West doesn't show up is the station density in the West is a lot less than it is in the East. And then the patterns are much less significant for first fall frost since the 1920s. So here are some of the trends when you average them across the U.S. And what you get is actually a change in the duration of the frost-free season that starts kind of kicking up really in the 90s overall. But the last spring frost date actually advanced markedly in the 1980s. And you'll hear a lot of people talk about the step change that occurred right around 1984 at the continental scale level and in these seasonal timing metrics. And the same thing, for the most part, occurs in the old world. You get the same inflection point right around 1984. And we don't really understand it that well. That's the inflection point that you also see in the annual phasing of temperature over the northern hemisphere that I showed you earlier. So that's the inflection occurring around 1984. For the first fall frost, the kick-up is actually much later. It's in the 1990s, and it's much less. So a lot of the changes in the length of the frost-free season and the growing season are actually due to advances in spring. So our first approach with this kind of stuff is start correlating it with the different EIEIOs. And what we've been finding is that for frost phenomena, it's actually not as well correlated as we would expect with any of these large-scale indices of atmospheric circulation and large-scale climatic nodes. It was a little bit of a surprise, but then after we thought it through, you know, these frost dates have a bit of randomness to them. Randomness in space and randomness in time. They're not as well organized as some other climatic variables. So that was for spring, and then this one is for fall. The circles, the outline circles, are actually places where the values are actually significant. And you can see that there's a lot less significant for fall, a little bit more for spring, but it's still not good enough. So these are some concluding statements about the duration and timing of the frost-free season. And I've kind of gone through this already, but I wanted to go to the fifth point where we're seeing that the interannual variation across the country is actually more associated with significant warming of the mean climate state that for the most part might be anthropogenic. So it's just kind of moving the annual phase in daily temperatures, moving it in time, and then that's moving the timing of when you get these frosts. And it's less driven by climate variability, natural climate variability associated with the large-scale indices. So we've also been working on spring indices. These have been developed for a while by Mark Schwartz, and they're again based on daily Tmax and Tmin, and then validated with the network that Joe started in the 1950s, and then Mark and others continued up until the present. So they're weather-based algorithms of plant development. They're calibrated and validated with lilac and honeysuckle observations, and the National Phenology Network has kind of taken over expanding this data set across the country. So you can go to the NPN website and actually download the data, or you could see the gridded index. You could actually see the gridded index for 2015. You can download the data, play around with it yourself. You can actually see animations of this. I'll show a little bit of it in a minute. So there are a bunch of people that have actually worked on this to look at the climatology. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they're in different places, even in Europe. And this methodology is now being used over the Northern Hemisphere, and people are playing around with this model as well. This is not the only model for things like first leaf and first bloom, but right now it's kind of the best one that's been used a lot for looking at the climatologies of spring onset. So this is a map of lilac observations. You can see that Joe did a really good job of sampling in the west, and we haven't done a very good job elsewhere. There's a lot more topographic complexity in the west. In the east, things like flowering and leaf out for something that's temperature sensitive, because temperature is so synchronous over large scales, you actually don't need that many points to sample it. But we're trying to increase the coverage so we can keep refining these models. So there are a lot of people that make these observations all over the country. So the spring index, we used to have chilling requirements included, and then after Mark and I had a bunch of conversations, we decided to drop the chilling requirements because they actually didn't make all that much difference. So we compared with a chilling requirement and without, and at the national scale and at the regional scale, we were getting pretty much the results. Maybe small offsets, but not enough to worry about. So we ended up dropping the chilling requirement, which allows us to take this model and map spring onset for the whole U.S. And there are lots of different things that you can do, but we primarily do first leaf, first bloom, and then a damage index. And by damage index, meaning that if you leaf out or flower too early, and then you get the occurrence of frost, that's where a lot of the damage comes to crops, and particularly fruit trees, but also in native ecosystems. So the model just tallies up the number of chilling hours if you use chilling that the plant has spent below minus 2.2 degrees C until the requirements met. We dropped the chilling requirement now, and so the model starts recording accumulation of recent growing degree date hours and the number of high energy synoptic events. And what that means is, by synoptic events means the advection of warm air from south to north. The number of events is something that we've come to understand that plants actually see. So that's also incorporated in the algorithms. So at daily time steps, the model keeps checking to see if the requirements for spring onset, whether it's first leaf or first flower, is assumed to occur. And there's a figure on the right-hand side that's a station for which we've calculated the spring index across the months of the year, showing the occurrence of the synoptic events and when it's actually met. So that's the basics for the spring index, and then I'm going to show you a few of the things that we've done with it. So there's some real advantages to this. First, you can generate this weather wherever you have daily Tmax and Tmin, or reanalysis data. The output is consistent over all areas. It is well validated, and then this index actually sees only the atmosphere and is free of local biological effects. So what we're trying to do is find an objective way to call the start of spring that's not complicated by a lot of biology, particularly for things that are sensitive to the early part of spring. So these are the stations for which we've calculated the spring index. And now, again, we're doing it with reanalysis data as well now, but this is kind of a recent development. So we've published a few papers on this, and you know, one of the first things that you can do is actually take the whole country and animate it, you know, over the 20th and 21st century. And so we can look at variations in spring onset over the whole country. And in fact, I've had in mind, I haven't had the time yet since I moved to Reston, of writing an almanac for the whole U.S. where I go through and take these patterns year by year, and I go through and look at the impacts of an early and late spring over the whole country and write like a coffee table book to try to promote the importance of seasonal timing. So you can also take a particular year and look at departures, in this case, z-scores. This is the first leaf date for 2015, showing this dipole between early and late spring onset across the continental U.S., across CONUS. And this is the bloom date, again, showing more or less the same thing. Generally, for lilac and honeysuckles, first leaf occurs before first bloom does. And so you can use the two indices for a lot of different things. And these things are highly correlated with all the other seasonal timing things that you know, including things like snow melt, center of mass, any change in seasonal transitions. This actually captures really well. This is the damage index that I just explained a second ago. And so if you average the spring index regionally over the U.S., you see these pretty marked differences in time and space. The western U.S. is in the red, and the eastern U.S. is in the blue. And you can see these tremendous differences that occurred before 1958. Why 1958? Because 1958 was a big change in the Arctic Oscillation. It was a big change in the Pacific North American pattern. And before that, it was actually relatively, spring was relatively early in the eastern U.S. And then it switched, and it became relatively late. And then it's only really since the 1980s that the East and the West have actually synchronized. I mean, I don't know how many of you have seen this stuff before, but until I started doing this, all of this was news to me. I just didn't really have a very good understanding of seasonal timing, particularly spring onset at the continental scale. And so the inflection point in 1958 is actually associated with something that's happening with high latitude circulation in the northern hemisphere. So that's pretty powerful. It ended up delaying spring onset, particularly in the southeastern U.S., as much in 1958 as spring onset has advanced in the West, starting in 1984. So we've also kind of drawn a target with years that you heard a lot about with the record temperatures in March of 2012 that ended up having huge impacts in fruit growing areas. In places like Michigan, you had tens of millions of dollars of damage to the fruit crop. And so we published a paper on the fall spring of 2012. You ended up with things leafing out and blooming much earlier, and then they got nailed by frost. And this was remarkable, breaking March temperature records. I think there were about 70 springtime temperature records that were broken by this one event. So we're also trying to focus on single events and try to sort out what's driving it. Where are the bullseyes in these changes? In this particular case in 2012, the bullseye is actually over the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes. And the climatological reason was a high pressure dome in the spring that just came out of the North Atlantic and moved over the eastern part of the continent. So these spring indices are not irrelevant. And you may wonder, what is that correlated with? And it's correlated with a lot of stuff, particularly the stuff that's sensitive to temperature in the early part of spring. So I just included a couple of examples here. This is, on the left, a time series in southeastern Oregon of Anjou pears for blooming of Anjou pears. And so what we've done here is we've taken the spring index for the whole state of Oregon and compared it to the bloom index for Oregon pears, which is a tremendous cash crop. I mean, in southeastern Oregon, it drives a lot of the economy. And our main problem with this, actually, as we were writing the paper, we did this because we got a reviewer comment. So I just went in and made a few phone calls and got a few records from people to sort of demonstrate the point. And the hardest time that we had with this paper was actually getting the Oregon pear correlations, the two curves, to not overlap as much so that we could actually see the reds and the blues because they were so close. The spring index predicts a lot of the variance in the bloom index for Oregon pears. The other one is Great Plains wheat headings. So wheat headings are when this is a particular cultivar of winter wheat called Kharkov, which is a very common cultivar in the plains. And there are about 6 different agricultural stations that actually measure this particular phenophase, which is when the flowering stalk emerges from the flag leaf. And so there's the phenophase that's formalized, and all the nurseries actually all the wheat nurseries actually make this measurement. And I was amazed. This is a paper that was written a long time ago by some friends of mine, and I'd always been amazed by how well organized it was. 6 agricultural stations from North Dakota all the way to Texas, and it's highly correlated across all those areas. You only need 6 points to actually get this. And so that's the spring index for that whole area in the plains, and it's well correlated except when it's dry. So during the 1930s and the 1950s drought, it's not well correlated because winter wheat is actually dry farmed, so it's not irrigated. And so if you don't add water, it doesn't really matter when spring onset occurs. So you can actually clean up the spring index and add something like vapor pressure deficit, and these two lines will probably overlap a great deal. So the spring index might be something that's really useful across lots of different disciplines and applications, including agriculture. And it's really well organized climatologically. And so if we can forecast spring onset a few months in advance, we can forecast a lot of phenomena. So we've been working on this. Greg Peterson was actually part of this paper that actually came, all these guys except for me and Mark Schwartz were students at the University of Arizona. And I think this paper started with us going out to coffee and talking about the things that you guys could work on. And we ended up...
Many bad coffee ideas.
Yeah, many bad coffee ideas. So we published this paper on Northern Hemisphere modes of variability and the timing of spring in Western North America, where we took the spring index and did principal component analysis and ended up getting these results where the first PC, so, this is orthogonal, so you look at the data in time and space and you identify the pattern that explains most of the variability, and then you go orthogonal to that pattern and then try to explain as much of the variance. And so the first pattern is this kind of west-wide subcontinental scale warming. So spring onset is actually synchronized for the most part over most of the western U.S. The second PC is a little different, and there's this north-south dipole that you see in the loadings of the PC analysis on the right-hand side. And the scores of the PC analysis, which are the time series, are down below. And you can kind of see this inflection point in the first principal component right in the mid-1980s, and it's kind of there as well in the second principal component. So, you know, this is a pattern that we've all been talking about that's driving things like a greater number of large wildfires, the Westerling et al. Paper, the earlier spring, the earlier snow melt in spring, the changes in the center of mass for stream flow, just about everything that we've been talking about is actually linked to these patterns that I'm showing. And they're highly correlated across a lot of different things. This is a paper that we published in Earth Interactions a couple of years ago, and showing that actually spring onset and spring snowmelt, using a snowmelt or a snow model that Greg McCabe built up, constructed, these are really correlated, and they're correlated even in the principal modes of variation. They both have pretty much the same pattern. So think about this. What I'm talking about is the same thing that Greg and I and others identified in this paper in Science in 2011, where over the last 800 years we reconstructed snowmelt accumulation. And the major pattern that we saw is that up until about 1980, for the most part, there was a dipole in variability. When the northern Rockies had a lot of snowpack, the central and southern Rockies had less snowpack, and vice versa. So that antiphase pattern, that dipole, which is driven primarily by Pacific decadal variability, is really stable. And then you get to right around 1980, and Pacific decadal variability is replaced by springtime warming as the major driver of snow accumulation in most of the West, and particularly in the Rockies, but also when you compare the Pacific Northwest and the Southwest, it's the same thing. This is the hockey stick curve of snow accumulation and spring onset in the West. So most of what we've been seeing is actually linked to this. And if you looked at I see I'm running out of time. But if you looked at all of these indices, they're all fairly well correlated, and you get to the mid-1980s, and you see it there. And I'm going to move on through this. I think I'm going to move. Emily, this got killed for some reason.
Did you go past that?
I don't think so. I did. Oh, there's actually an animation at the end.
Oh, Adobe's not going to play that.
Yeah, okay. So the point that I wanted to make is that a lot of these things are actually tied to things like ENSO and PDO variability, the Pacific variability, and not just anthropogenic warming. And we're right now on the verge of a major, actually there it is. We're now on the verge of a major El Nino that may be the biggest El Nino we've had since 1950. And I think what we're actually going to see is a change in climatic regime, in the natural climate variability that's going to look more like the period from about 1976 to 1995. So the Southwest is going to be really wet, and the Northwest is going to be really dry for the most part. And right now everybody's talking about the fact that this may be the warmest year in record for the Northern Hemisphere, and that's primarily because now the anthropogenic warming is going to be going in the same direction as the climate variability, with the Pacific Ocean warming up. So how do we use this information? Like, we have this information, we can make a lot of forecasts. So the critical point right now is that we have a lot of tools, and it's time for us, instead of wasting a lot of the science that we're paying for, to use it for decision making across the U.S. and particularly in the Western U.S. Thanks very much.